Hi everyone. In this session, we are going to see about final method and classes in Java. So before seeing final method and final classes, we have to see or discuss about final keyword. In Java, if you this is not access specifier. Final it is not access specifier or access modifier. It's a keyword notifying that a few meanings. For example, if you put a variable as a final, that variable is going to act as a constant. If you put a function as a final, that function cannot be overridden or redefined in the subclasses. If you put a class as a final, that class cannot be inherited or never inherited. So to prevent the changing of variable value, redefining the changing the method definition, inheriting the classes, final keyword is used in Java. Come, let's see how it is used in Java. Final keyword. Final is a keyword. It is a non-access modifier for Java elements. Final is a keyword can be used along with the variables, methods and classes. If it is a final variable, it is a constant. If it is a final method, it is prevents method overriding. If it is a final class, it prevents inheritance or never, the classes can never subclassed. That is what the uses of the final keyword, right? That is what the thing. So final variable, you can stop the value change. You cannot change the variable value. Once it is declared, it act like a constant. Final variable means you cannot, final method means you cannot override the method, which is preventing the method. Method overriding means you are changing the method definition in the subclass. So that is prevented by using final keyword. If you put a method as a final, the overriding is prevented. And if you put a class as a final, it is never subclassed. It can be never inherited. It cannot be inherited. That is what it is prevents the inheritance. That is what called as final class, right? Now we'll see it one by one. Final variable, final method, final class, one by one. Let's start with the final variable. A variable is either a member variable or local variable with the final keyword is called a final variable. So if you put a variable as a final, that variable can act as a constant, or else you can create a constant variable with the final variable. That is what the thing. Final variables are nothing but constants. So the value of the final variable cannot be changed once it is initialized, whereas the variable value can be changed at any point of time. We know that, right? That is what the variable means varying. But whereas if you put a variable as a final, you cannot change the value once it is initialized. That is what the point. When the variable is declared with the final keyword, the value cannot be modified. So that is about the final variable. And how to initialize final variable. A final variable must be initialized, otherwise the compiler will throw an error, right? It is act like a constant, right? You have to say what is the value, right? So final variable can only be initialized once, which is only one time you can initialize, either by using initializer or by the assignment statement. Come, let's see the several ways to initialize the final variable. First one is you can initialize the final variable when it is declared. So at the declaration itself, we can initialize the variable as a final. And in some cases, if the variable is not initialized at the time of declaration, it must be initialized inside the constructor, right? So constructor, we know that, right? Constructor is a special function, same name as a class name. Inside that constructor, you can initialize that final variable. Such variable is called as blank variable, blank final variable, right? So a blank final variable can be initialized inside instance initializer. Instance initializer means that is variable initializer, right? Or else you can inside the constructor also it can be initialized. A blank final static variable. Blank final means you cannot change. Static means common value is shared among, right? That's what the static property. So inside the static block. So inside the static block, if you are declaring the final initializing the variable, it's going to be called a blank final static variable, right? We'll have an example. So in a static variable, we will be having that one, right? Blank final variable. Yeah. Right. That is what static block. And we'll see an example of final variable. So class point. So I'm having final, it is not access modifier, public is access modifier, public final int x equal to 1. So at the time of declaration itself, variable is initialized. And next is declared only, it's a blank variable, right? So it is declared, it can be initialized inside the constructor. So y equal to 2. So y is declared as a final, it is initialized inside the constructor. So blank final variable. So next is static final int z, but it is not initialized. So it can be initialized inside static block. For that only I have shown that static variable or static block. So inside the static block, you can initialize the blank static final variable. So blank means it is not initialized, means that's blank. Static final means it can be initialized inside a static block, right? So this is how the variables, a normal final variable, blank final variable, static final variable are initialized. So in a main function, I called all the variables. So pt.x, pt.y, and z. So this, why it is not used object, right? Because it is static. Static members can be called straight away. It is not necessary to have an object. That's what the property of static, right? If you're declaring a variable as static, it can be called directly. If it is having a static property, it can be called directly. So no need of object initialization. So next is final method. So final methods, if you declare a method as a final, it cannot be overridden. You cannot change the definition in the subclass. That is what the final method. A method with the final keyword is called final method. Final method cannot be overridden by the subclass. So that is what the point. And if you override a final method in subclass, it throw an error, right? So because it is final, you cannot override. If you're trying to override that, it throws in a compilation error. That shows that final methods are inherited, but they are not eligible for overriding. You can inherit, you can use in a subclass, but you cannot override it, or you cannot change the definition of the final method, right? So a final method cannot be overridden, which means even though a subclass can call a final method of a parent class without any issue, which is inherited means you can call with the derived class object, right? That is what the point, but you cannot override it. A constructor cannot be declared as final. Why? Constructor is going to be it is never inherited, right? So it is never inherited means it never changed in the subclass. So if it is changing in a subclass only, we are putting as a final. So it is never inherited, and same way it is never, there is no possibility of changing the definition of constructor in a subclass. Base class constructor won't be changed in the derived class derived class, so that it is no meaning of having this final, right? So constructor cannot, if you put a constructor as a final, it is no meaning, because it is never inherited. If it is inherited only, it is going to be redefined, right? So it is never inherited means it is never going to be changed in the subclass. That is what constructor cannot be declared as a final. Let's see an example. Class name is final demo. Public final void display. So display function declared as a final. So definition of the display method. So a main class extends this class, So public void final display is redefined here or overridden here. If you're trying to overridden the final method in a base class, right? So if you are trying to change, so here also you're putting public final void display. So for this main class, this is the final method. If you're that, but the function name is same, right? So in that case, this function is inherited over here. It is redefining the definition. In that case, it throw an compilation error, which means overridden method is final. This display method is overridden, which is final. You cannot override it. So if you're trying to do that, compilation error throws that overridden method cannot be, sorry, final method cannot be overridden, right? That's about the final method. Next is final class. So what I said, if you put a class of final, it is never inherited. You cannot inherit the final class, or else it prevents the inheritance. So when a class is declared as with the final keyword, it can be called as final class. If a class is marked as final, there is no class can inherit any feature from the final class. Which means final class cannot be inherited, which means we cannot extend the final class, right? So what is the necessity of having the final class? So in some cases, we wanted to prevent the originality of the classes. The developer or any programmer or your teammate or any user or any functionality or any other entity should not or not allowed to change the class and class components. In that case, I can have the final class. That is what the point I have given over here. Prevent the class being subclassed could be particularly useful to write APIs or libraries and want to avoid being extended or alter the base class behavior. Or a developer of this class is wanted to no one to change the functionality of my class, so he kept as a final. Say if the developer kept as a final, it is never subclassed and no one changed the base class property. If for example a string class is the class available in a Lang package, it was kept as final because there is no need to change or not allowed to change the functionality of the string class because all the methods are already defined. So it is not allowed to override the methods of the string class. So for that only, almost all the important classes are kept as final in the java.lang. Almost all the library functions in java.lang or in a Java are kept as final only because it is not allowed to change the override the methods, right? That's about the final class. Let's say an example. So class name is class final class. This is the syntax. So it is having a prefix as final, which means this class is going to be final class, can never be inherited. It is not allowed to extend it. It is having one method, and I'm putting another main method extends the final class. So this final class is for the meaning I put as a final class. This is actually final keyword. So this class is going to be acting as a final class. If you're trying to extend that class, it throws an compilation error, which means it cannot inherit from the final class. This class is class name. So this class cannot be inherited because it is final. So that is what, if you're trying to, while compiling, it is throwing the compilation error. So that's about the final class. So with that, we are finishing the final keyword, that is final variable, final method, and the final classes. Thank you.